Hi, Thomas. What are you working on?
I have to admit that I've been working on these reports for the past few days. And the worst thing is that I have to create the same reports over and over again. And it's really tedious. I feel like I am repeating myself 3 times a day, because 3 reports every single day. One before noon, one right after noon, and one before the evening. And it's just, and it seems like I'm wasting a lot of time. So I'm thinking, instead of writing all these reports over and over again, why don't we just use R and automate these reports by writing some code, pulling in the fresh data 3 times a day, and creating a beautiful PDF file or HTML file for distribution. That sounds much better, right? In R, the best environment for report automation, for creating code, chunks of code, output beautiful layouts, is called Markdown. And Markdown is actually used across different environments. You can use Markdown in R, you can use Markdown in Python, but it seems that it is the ultimate environment to automate reporting. Let's now go to our studio and create a Markdown report. If you've been using our studio for some time, creating variables, going through the pre-class videos, you will have this window a little bit different. I actually closed my RStudio and reopened it from scratch, but it shouldn't really matter whether we are using a new RStudio window or one that we've been working on for quite some time. It shouldn't really matter. But the reason why I'm opening it fresh is that my environment will be entirely empty. I like to show you that our Markdown does not require anything in the environment for it to run. It is a self-sustainable environment, reporting environment, in which you will pull the data from a data source, analyze, run, manipulate, right, transform, and then output some results in a report. In order to open a R Markdown environment, we're going to go to the white plus sign on the green circle in the upper left-hand corner. And in this drop-down, you will notice a R Markdown option. So we're going to click on this one on the R Markdown. And here we are going to open or create a new document. What's really important is that we specify a title. Markdowns or Markdown reports can be identified based on the title. So in this case, I'm going to call it pre-class video number 1. All right. And the author here, instead of Captain Jack Sparrow, we're going to say Thomas Carnegie. Okay, good. Now, we have 3 options here. We have an HTML output format, PDF, and Word output formats. It's easiest to create the HTML output format. It does not require any other software dependencies. The PDF output format requires a version of LaTeX. If it's on a Windows, it's MikTeX. If it's a Mac, it's MacTeX. And these require a lot of installations. We're not going to go that route. The Word version here requires Microsoft Word. So we're not going to be using this. We're going to be using the HTML because it does not require any other installations. So we're going to just make sure that the HTML is highlighted and then click the OK button. So clicking OK. And in the upper left-hand corner of our RStudio, where we would see the script with our code, we are getting our Markdown report. Oh, and guess what? The title is exactly as we defined it in the pop-up window. The author, same thing, exactly the same as we saw in the pop-up window. The date is, well, today's date. I am recording this on September 21st, 2021. And the output here is an HTML document. It is really important that you do not modify this Markdown header. If you modify any of this code, it might compromise your output. So best not to touch it. Between these 3 dashes, 3 opening dashes, 3 closing dashes, and anything in between, do not modify it. If you have to change the output format to a PDF or to a Word file, I would suggest opening up a new Markdown report, getting the pop-up window, and then selecting a different version in that pop-up window. We don't touch this header. Okay, now moving on, what's really important is that this Markdown document, any Markdown document, is going to have chunks of code. We call them cells. These chunks of code are identifiable by these 3 opening, I call them accents. So accent, 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 opening and closing, three accents. Now, after the opening 3 accents, we will see these curly brackets. These curly brackets are defining this cell, this chunk of code. The first argument in this curly brackets is the language in which we write the code in this cell. In our case, it's our language. The second one is the name of this chunk of code. The name has to be unique. We cannot have 2 chunks of code in the same Markdown document that are called using the same name. So we have to be very careful using unique names for our chunks of code. And then we have a comma. After the comma, we can specify a lot of different options, okay? And these options, actually, we can get a list of these options here, chunk options. So we have a lot of chunk options here. We have code evaluation, text output, code decoration, cache, plots, animation, code chunk. So there's a lot in here, right, that we can modify when creating these chunks. And there are some examples here. So I highly encourage you to go through these chunk options. And again, I got there by clicking on this, how do you call it? Mechanical wheel, I guess, right? Clicking on this, and we're going to get chunk options here at the bottom. It's a link. If you're using a Windows computer or a older version of RStudio, you might not get this. But if you're using a pretty new RStudio on a Mac, you're going to get this link at the bottom of this window. Now we can also define many different chunk options in this window. We can just click on this drop down. We're going to see show output only, show code on output, show nothing. So we're not going to be seeing this chunk in our report, or show nothing and don't run the code. So there are different options here. I am going to show code and output. All right, show code and output. If you are creating a report for extremely senior people or your clients, you probably want to hide the code, right? In that case, I would select show the output only. But since it's a learning video, I'm going to show the code and the output. So I'm going to select this. I am going to try and select and unselect these show warnings and show messages because I don't want to see any of the warnings. So I am going to unselect this, all right? Same thing with messages. I do not want to see any warning messages, right? So I'm going to simply unselect these two. Now, if I click apply and go back to my code, I will see all of these chunk options in here. I'm going to see echo equals true because I want to see the code. I'm going to see message equals false. I don't want to see any messages, and warning equals false. I don't want to see any warning messages because that will trash my report. It's going to add noise, more text to my report, and it's really insignificant. Now, just by using this template that RStudio gave us, this template has this option here specified, include equals false. I actually want to remove this include equals false with the comma. So remove the comma, remove the include equals false, because I want to include my setup chunk in my report. If I were to leave that in place, then this output would not be included in my report. So we're going to keep this in. Okay, good. Now this chunk here is used to run some code, right? I could, for example, take the very well-known empty cars data set and run a summary on empty cars, right? Summary on empty cars. And then I am expecting our Markdown report to have a summary table of all the variables in empty cars. Going down, this is something else. The first cell chunk of code was actual R code, right? With one function, summary of empty cars. Now this second piece in my Markdown report is simple text, okay? Now this text is very useful because I can write my own comments, I can write conclusions, recommendations, anything that I would manually write in a report, right? We can define different fonts. If I use these hashtags in my Markdown report, this will create a bigger font, a header. It's bigger font, thicker, bolded, right? And I believe that we can actually check this and test it. 3 hashtags create a smaller header, 2 hashtags create a medium header, and 1 hashtag creates the biggest header. So just keep in mind these hashtags here create headers, right, for a given text that is below, right? And here's where I can write my text. I can insert links to different websites, make it more interactive. I can also use parameters from my code in this text, but that's more advanced. Just FYI, we can use variables, vectors, and outputs from the R code in our text to make it even more automatable, more streamlinable. Okay, and then we have a second chunk of code here. This chunk of code, again, is in the R language. Now it's called cars, and it's going to give us a summary of the cars data frame. So in the first chunk, we had summary of empty cars. In the second chunk, we have summary of cars. After the second chunk of code, we have another headline, which says including plots. You can also embed plots, for example. Now this is just a piece of text that's going to be rendered in my report. And a third chunk of code, in this case, it's called pressure, and I'm going to plot the pressure. We'll see what this means a little bit later. And again, at the end, some text. How do I run this report? How do I get the report output? Well, I'm going to click on this knit icon here with the spool of wool, with the blue spool of wool. I'm going to click on knit, and it's going to ask me where I want to save this HTML Markdown report. I'm going to save it on my desktop. That's fair enough. I have a lot of junk here. I'm just going to click save on my desktop. And of course, I could have given a different name for that file. It defaulted to untitled, but that's okay. So look, we got the report. We got this report with the title of my report, with the author and the date on which it was created. Now, remember, we have selected a few different options in the first chunk of code, including that I want to see the code of that chunk. So echo equals true will indicate that I want to see the R code that I wrote in that chunk of code in that cell. And not surprisingly, it prints the summary of empty cars. So we have the distribution of each variable from empty cars in the output here in this report. Then, if you remember, we had this beautiful headline, right? So apparently this hashtag also pops up. It's an HTML file, right? Text and some text with a interactive link to a website, but we could also include some data points, elements, parameters from the code that we ran above, right? We could, for example, call in this text some descriptive statistics from this summary output for empty cars. Okay, now the next cell, the next chunk of code was quoting summary of cars. Oh, well, actually, this data frame was much different. It only had the speed and the distance, right? So a little bit of a different data set, in this case, 2 variables only. Then we had also some text. We had a headline and some simple text and a plot. We were plotting the pressure from this data frame. And again, at the very end, we had some text. So look, we just created our report. And what's beautiful about this is that if by any chance our data were to change, this report would automatically update with that fresh data. So going back to the video that I've recorded earlier, I wouldn't have to rewrite this report by hand 3 times a day. I could just run from R and the fresh data will pull in automatically into this report. At the end, I could publish this report. I can either print this in a printer, but that's not best practice. The best practice would be to publish this report on the R server. So if I go to this republish, actually you might see publish or republish in the upper right-hand corner. You can actually connect to different accounts on the R Studio server, and they are free. So look into it. Your homework is to look into getting a free account on the R Pubs server. Actually, we can go there and publish your report on the R Pubs server. But what's also really important is that after knitting this document, once we get this window, we can close it and go to the directory where it was saved. In my case, it was on the desktop. I'm going to see this untitled HTML file. And if I open up this file, it has my report. It has my code. It has my output. It has all the text. And now I can share this. I can send via email. I can store it to a shared drive. I can create a repository of my reports and store copies, right? So 2 possibilities: either publish on a server and then share it with users through a link through a server, much more convenient for your end user, or save it locally to your computer. In my case, it was the desktop, but you can select any folder locally on your computer or to a shared drive. Time for a challenge. What I'm going to ask you to do is to find your own data set and try to create a Markdown report that has a few chunks of code with some outputs. It could be a summary function. It could be a plot. It could be a ggplot visual, and write some text that supports your analysis, supports your visuals. So select any data frame that you have access to, and then create your own report based on that data. Now, the most exciting part of Markdown is that we sometimes get errors, and debugging Markdown is not the easiest. So for example, if I were to, on purpose, make a mistake in my first chunk of code, instead of saying summary, I would say summer, and there is no such function as summer, so we know that this is going to give us an error. If I knit this document, it'll give us an error. And it says, error in summer, empty cars, could not find the function summer. So all I have to do is go to my to the window, lower left-hand corner window, where my Markdown is talking with me, and read the error. And it'll usually indicate where the error is coming from. In this case, it says that it's in the summer empty cars line of code. Could not find the function. So very quickly, I'm going to fix this error. Sometimes this error message in the lower left-hand corner is less obvious. It'll give some more cryptic information. Well, if that's the case, my suggestion is to debug each chunk of code individually. So I start with the first chunk of code, with the first in the order that I wrote my Markdown report. And what I'm going to do is run each of these chunks independently using this green run current chunk. Okay, and if the error comes from this chunk, it would pop up the error right now. But apparently this chunk is okay, so it works. Then I go to the second chunk, and if by any chance the error is in this chunk, when I click the green run current chunk icon, it'll give me an error, could not find function summa. So then I'm gonna have to go back to the code and fix this error, right? All I have to do is read the error. But this is a really good way to debug your Markdown report if you get a weird error after you knit the entire document. Because again, your document will be extremely lengthy, usually, right? Those are big reports. And then the easiest way to debug an error that's unclear is to run each chunk of code independently and then try to find the error inside that chunk that gives the error. So that's what I found to be the most useful. So good luck.